Thank you. And please just ask questions as we go along. And so what I'm going to do here is rehearse one of the central arguments of the book. But since the book came out, there's been a lot of debate about this argument. So I'm actually hopefully going to present some new evidence as well to buttress the claim of the book. Okay? And so the key puzzle facing all long-run economic history is why we've only had economic growth for 0.1% of humanity's existence on the earth, right? For the previous 100,000 years, more than 100,000 years, average rates of technological advance were well below 0.01% per year, right? And only in a very short period of history have we actually managed to sustain significant economic growth, which is all based on technological advance. And the puzzle then is how to account for that. And it turns out that within economic history, 99.9% of economic historians believe that the explanation of this is some kind of institutional failure in early societies, that essentially what trapped us in this pre-industrial world was the failure to develop the appropriate set of institutions. And this book tries to take a different line, because one reason is it's monotonous if everyone in the subject agrees on something. And what the summary of the argument I'm going to make here is that it's important that before 1800, all societies, including England, were Malthusian, that they were trapped in this world where, on average, people had 2 surviving children, right? Modern family size was achieved long before the modern world in terms of the number of resulting surviving children. That pre-industrial England, in particular, was also, for at least 600 years before 1800, a Darwinian society where there's selective survival of a particular group of people within the society, and these were the people who succeeded economically, and that this was different to hunter-gatherer societies where the evidence is limited, but the suggestion is that those who command resources in these societies are actually people who succeed with violence. And so in some sense, it is a kind of institutional argument, but one that says that institutions don't operate immediately. They operated over the course of thousands of years by changing human nature, that we've adapted to the institutions of modern property rights and non-violent allocation of goods within society. And that in this period, 1150 to 1800 in England, you can actually see clear signs of changes in the basic psychology of individuals, in their basic economic behavior, that things like people's time preference rates are actually visibly declining in England between 1300 and 1800. We became more patient, we became less violent, and that the triumph of capitalism then may lie as much in the changing of people's basic preferences as in the achievement of incentives, right? And so the idea here, and also by implication, there could well be modern societies where the best economic incentives would still not produce any economic growth, because you also have to have this cultural transformation. Now, the important thing in the book is I hedged on this and said it could be genes or culture that's changing. As a result of the somewhat vicious debate since then, I've actually had to kind of reassess that position, and I've concluded that it's much more likely to be genes than actual culture. That the genetic explanation is actually much stronger than I realized. And I'll say a little bit here about why that has to be the case. So here's the summary of world economic history that we have, which is, as I say, at least 120,000 years of stasis in living conditions, and then in our own era, enormous growth by some countries, and surprisingly, decline in income per capita below pre-industrial levels by a lot of, for example, modern Africa is probably poorer than the average pre-industrial society. And what kept the world in this phase was just, we can describe the earlier economy by just 3 very simple and almost self-evident assumptions. Each society has a birth rate. It's determined by customs regulating fertility, but it's important that it's either flat or increasing with material living standards. There's a death rate in each society which will decline as living standards improve. Okay? And it turns out that most of the gains in life expectancy that we've witnessed since the pre-industrial era seem to stem from increases in income per capita more than modern medicine. We got to average life expectancies of something like 65 years based just on increases in income. Medicine has added another 10 years. But it is interesting that they consequently had that potential in pre-industrial societies as well of achieving modern life expectancies. And that material living standards decline as population increases, and that's just a consequence of the fact that land in these societies is an important part of production in all of these societies. It's about 1/5 of the income in societies where we could measure this. And consequently, if you double the number of people, then you don't double the output of the society because of that fixed factor. So it's a very nice application of something in Economics 1, a nice illustration. And once we have these three assumptions, we can put them together in this nice little graphic, which is, it's not of my devising. This existed in the literature for a long time. And what you actually see then is you've got this birth rate, death rate in the top axis here. This is income per capita in each of the horizontal axes. And this is population here. And you get this inverse relationship. And then, okay, here's the pointer. What will happen if we start with some arbitrary population n0? What will happen then is that if that's above this n star, birth rates will exceed death rates. Population has to keep on increasing until you get to this one unique equilibrium. And the crucial feature of this equilibrium, y star, is that it's only determined by death rates and by birth rates. It has nothing to do with the production technology of the society. What that means then is that improvements in technique, which were occurring at a slow rate in the pre-industrial world, because they're only occurring at a very slow rate, initially, with the population here at n star, the improvement will increase living standards, but always, eventually, that increase in living standards gives way to just an increase in population. And so you see 130,000 BC, I think the world population is estimated about 10,000 people. By 1750, it's 770 million. So there had been very slow but very significant technological advance in this pre-industrial world, but all of it simply going into increasing the population. And so you get this puzzle then that in the pre-industrial world, there's going to be no expectation of any increase in living standards unless either birth rates can be reduced or counterintuitively unless death rates can be increased. And the other thing about this Malthusian world is that it's completely contrary to most of our intuitions in terms of what actually helps people. Because of this fact that one of the big things that will help them is, in terms of material living standards, is just to increase death rates. Yeah, sorry.
You just click on that. With that period, was it 1350, whenever the plague sort of hit for the next 50 years, you said something will increase the death rate, and that will increase income. Is that consistent with that?
Oh yeah, I mean, and I haven't got it on the slides here, but one of the if we look at, actually I can do this on the next slide. This slide here shows output per person versus population for England back to the 1200s. And it turns out England has this fantastic economic data, and so I spent a lot of time trying to excavate that. And what you'll see is there are these significant swings in population, and they're accompanied by these huge swings in living standards. And you do get this kind of, all the way from the 1200s up till about the 1650s, it's essentially on this one very flat schedule. You really get that kind of the pre-industrial population income trade-off shows up very clearly. And what you see here is that in the 1310s was the low point of English income. Then comes the Black Death around about this period here. It leads to initial decline of population, quite sharp one, but then sustained declines to 1450. And then you get living standards in the 1450s that exceed those of the eve of the Industrial Revolution. And in fact, for agricultural workers, the living standards in the 1450s were not equaled again until after World War I in England. And so you could actually get very rich pre-industrial societies if you had the right combination of birth rates and death rates. But what you see is essentially, in England, there is this status that in the 1790s, you're not any better off than in the 1200s, according to these measures. And that you're wobbling around this, but you're headed just upwards here in terms of greater population with the improvement in technology. Here you see the improvement in technology going on from around about 1600s, right?
So what's with the 1200s?
Oh.
You want to see this kind of curve, if you want right to the previous slide,
right.
You want to see the 1200s below the 1400s.
Yeah, well, another influence here, by the way, is weather. And this is very heavily agrarian society. Now, England, in this period, was growing grapevines. There are vineyards in England, and this is known as a period of medieval maximum, where the climate is very good. And it got colder in Britain after the late Middle Ages. And so that could actually just be, I mean, this is only a 10, 20% difference, so it could be this effect, or it could...
technology shock, basically?
Right, yes, from the weather, right? Or it just could be mismeasurement, right? The data here is pretty good after about 1260, after about here. Earlier on, it's pretty poor. So still trying to update that data. And yeah, it would be nicer if it would actually coincide with this other period. And then also estimating population is much more difficult in this early period.
You're the economic historian,
right?
Me, but I've read a bit of Hume's history, and he's got a footnote about one of the richest barons under Henry VII. So that'd be around 1450
right.
period, and just how miserably poor that guy was. He'd get all of his possessions on a couple of ox carts and transports them from one household to another.
Right.
So if one of the richest guys
right.
in the country is poor enough that everything he owns
right.
can get thrown onto a couple of ox carts, and
right.
he's got a big household, but
right.
even himself he can have meat
right.
2 months a year.
Right.
How is it that that farm workers are
right? These are the
worse off than
right.
even for one?
I can just tell you from the wage data is very clear that workers are very well off, and it shows up even in the language of this period. You talk about a worker getting his meat and his drink if he's hired with food, right? Because they diet switched and became very heavily meat-based in this period. In the earlier period before the Black Death, the workers are fed mainly grains or porridge. Alcohol consumption is at very high levels. I mean, they behave, at least at the working class level, as though they're actually a very wealthy society in this period. And I thought that wage data had to be incorrect because it was so good. I went back and I collected a bunch more data. We calculated it, got the price evidence. It's just absolutely the case that 15th century England was a worker's paradise.
So Hume was wrong.
Yes, yes, right. Now remember where Hume is writing, right? I mean, there's just been a lot more evidence gathered since then. And then also remember, at this time, the population of England fell to 2.2 million, right? It was 6 million up here. And so I don't yet have good evidence. The evidence on land rents is not so good, but if you think of the upper classes depending on land rents, they might not particularly have been beneficiaries of this sliding down of population. Question?
Now, what population are you looking at? Agricultural laborers, laborers plus yeoman farmers, or the entire population?
This estimate here is based on the wages of farm laborers, which are a large chunk of the society, the wages of town laborers, and builders' assistants, the wages of builders. So there's 3 wage series. Then there's a price series and a rent series for land as well, and that's another chunk of income. And then the last thing I have is there's a housing rental estimate. And so that's actually covering a fair chunk of the income in society. I mean, you've got structures, land, so with capital, land, and labor income. And it's just chained back using what's happening to these different elements of income.
Where's the urban middle class?
Well, they're showing up. Some of these building workers are there, but you don't have the real urban middle class. But it's going to be pretty small in this early society, right?
Not in 1790.
Right. In 1790s, maybe more, right? But this would take us too far afield for what I want to talk about here. That we could have a whole other seminar on what happened to English income. But I could explain that we have evidence on wage distribution, at least just at this lower end. And if I don't think it's going to affect that outcome too much, but we can discuss this afterwards. Actually, it would just take us too far afield. So this is the Malthusian trap, and one of the predictions is that living standards would not increase in this period, and that's actually for my colleagues in history. Initially they said this absolutely cannot be correct as a description of the pre-industrial world 1800 because here's a picture of the Nucac, who are a modern foraging group in Venezuela. And this shows their material circumstances. It shows a lot of what they own. And this gets back to your question, which is, here's a middle class, upper class family in England in 1789. Look at the riches of, they could be in the suburb of Christchurch at present, and they're living very well. How could it be possibly the case that really there's no advance from hunter-gatherer times to England even in 1800? And it turns out that we can actually do a score sheet of England in 1800 versus the Stone Age, and the answer is that it looks like there really is no general improvement in living standards. So one thing is, what's the average consumption of calories per day? For England, we can estimate the total output of the society, imports and exports, the population, and we get this estimate of about 2,300 calories a day, which is not a bad diet. I mean, the important thing about that is it's not a starvation diet. This is actually quite a healthy diet. We have estimates from modern forager societies. It's about the same in terms of their average calorie input per day. And this is from a number of anthropological studies. You can look at the protein per day, and actually it's better in forager societies because they get a lot more meat. Whereas the English diet for the poor is much more heavily based on grains and porridge, potatoes in this period. Another estimate you can get is actually, now remember, these are modern foragers. What about male height? So it turns out, this is very convenient for illustration, I'm 67 inches. That's the average height of someone in England in 1800, and we get all these records of convicts sent to Australia, military recruits, indentured servants sent to Americas. So we have a whole variety of these height measures. What is it for modern forager societies? The median, it varies quite a lot, but the median is about the same, 6.5 inches. More directly, we can actually measure skeletal heights in Northern Europe back to the Middle Stone Age, the Mesolithic, and it's about 67 inches for those skeletons. I mean, again, there's just absolutely no sign of any general improvement. What is interesting, by the way, here is England in 1800 is significantly wealthier than China, India, or Japan, as far as we can tell. And so it could well be that for the average person in the world, you've actually got significant declines in living conditions going up towards 1800, because English income per capita in this period, in Japan there's fairly good measures, and it suggests that something like 50% of English living standards in this period, right? Japanese heights, I think we don't have male heights from there. We have it only starting about the 1880s when they started recruiting people to the army. But I think it's something like 62 or 63 inches for males in that period. It's some of the smallest heights measured. We get estimates of Chinese, people born in China in the early 19th century who moved to Australia in the gold rush, were later arrested and had their heights measured. And it turns out, I think they come into at about 64 inches, right? And so actually the height evidence is quite consistent. Indentured Indian servants sent to Fiji and to East Africa come in again about 64 inches in this period. And so hunter-gatherers seem to have been, in Europe at least, significantly taller than most of the people living in the world around about 1800. The next thing we can ask is, what about male work hours per day? We get very nice estimates from England in this period. We can directly estimate labor hours in things like agriculture. You know, the day is roughly 10 hours. They work 300 hours, a year, so we can estimate it that way. There's a very nice study that someone did, though, which looked at the records of the Old Bailey, which records crimes and the circumstances of crimes. And he could use this as spot observation on people's work and other activities in the course of the day. And it gives, because it's for a criminal trial, it gives by that time quite accurate timing of when these events were occurring. And he's actually able to calculate independently the average amount of time people worked in London in this period, and it's very consistent with his other data. I mean, it really suggests going across the whole year, the average male is putting in about 8.5 hours of work. By the way, that's about the same as in modern England if you count not just paid work, but also commuting time, childcare, I count all of that as work, and house repairs. And so when you get these time studies in modern England, the interesting thing is that we work about the same. The evidence for hunter-gatherer societies is that they did significantly less work. And initially I actually thought, well, that's a product of the incentive systems of these societies where typically sharing is very important. If I go out and hunt and catch something and I bring it back to camp, I have to share it out with all the people. And sometimes the other people get more than you do in these sharing arrangements. And there's lots of evidence that hunter-gatherers try to cheat in these sharing, that if it's a small animal, they try and cook it away from camp, that they don't internalize these sharing rules. They know they have to do it, but they don't want to do it. And so it seemed like it would just be that, it could just be that the incentives of these societies are such that people are simply not going to put in very much work effort because of this very, very high marginal tax rates that people face in these societies. Now, the interesting thing is, if we go back to our Malthusian model here, what's the effect of the English? Probably worked much less in the Middle Ages, and in particular the Catholic Church prescribed very large numbers of saints' days. And by the way, you didn't not just work on the saints' day, you stopped work on the day before in preparation, and so that was midday on the day before. And so I don't know if anyone actually honored all of these rules, because it would have paralyzed commerce for a large fraction of the year. But if you think about this, working more, if you suddenly move from 6 hours to 8.5 hours in this pre-industrial world, it's like a technological advance, right? Now the same stock of people can produce this much larger amount of output. Initially, it would increase incomes per capita. But then, through the operation of this Malthusian mechanism, you'd actually move back to the old equilibrium. And it turns out, in this pre-industrial world, hard work is actually dysfunctional, right? If work has a disutility, achieving a social structure where you can limit people's hours to the minimum amount per day will actually lead to higher utility in the society, because the English had to scramble to get the same subsistence as hunter-gatherers with much greater amounts of work input. And then the last thing we could say is, well, it's not just work, there's also life expectancy. Life expectancy in England is actually very high for 1800 at 38 years at birth.
In 1696, Gregory King, in his famous study of the distribution of national income in the United Kingdom, found that 45% of British adults had no known economic function or occupation. So they were nothing.
They were parasites. I don't. Again,
I do not agree.
I think he's wrong. Yeah. It turns out for forager societies, the median is 33, and so there might be some slight advantages for the English there. But actually, if you think about it, if you were choosing which society you would be in, life expectancy at birth is not the most relevant parameter, because a lot of people die in the first year of life, and if I die then, I don't really think I have that much stake. I might much more care about place me in a society where life expectancy at 10 or 20 is good, because that's something I'm going to know about and worry about. And there, if you actually look, it turns out that hunter-gatherer societies are just as good as England and probably better, because England has this pattern, they have a differential pattern of mortality over the lifespan. Question?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I can attack this question a little bit, but these forager societies, are we talking about the forager societies in Northern Europe going back at
No.
or this is like forager societies in tropical environments where the coconuts fall from the trees.
Right.
I don't have to hardly lift a finger before my meal comes to me.
Right.
The fish jump out of the water to my boat. I mean, it seems like if I'm trying to compare that
Right.
environment, that's not really the right comparison to talk about. I mean, it is one
Right.
way to talk about politics and
Right.
everything, but in substance, what you want to know is to what extent production has improved the quality of life of people in England, not compared
Right.
to what they are in.
For the forager societies, the ones we can do this kind of measure, calories, life expectancy, work hours, are essentially the remnant surviving forager societies. It includes some Australian Aboriginals, it includes, but it also includes, there were some studies done of Eskimo, Inuit, North American Plains Indians. So some of these height measures are actually coming from, those were some of the earliest anthropometric studies that were done. And so it's just whatever I could get, right? And it's across a range of environments, but a lot of them, it's admitted, tend to be in tropical regions now and inaccessible.
Best case
Right.
scenario.
And there is one worry about these societies, which is, why are they still hunter-gatherers, right? I mean, why haven't they? Could there be some peculiarity about this group? So, for example, the book makes a reference, there's a group in Brazil who allegedly have no number system, right? They're a hunter-gatherer group who allegedly do not have the numbers 1, 2, and 3. They have roughly 1, roughly 2, roughly 3, and a lot, right? But not in the sense they can't learn arithmetic, right? They cannot reliably be taught to add 1 and 3 and produce 4, right? And some question is, well, you know, are they representative of the early history of mankind? Or one argument that's been made is, well, there must be some genetic defect or some other problem that afflicts this group that, you know, and that's kept them in this hunter-gatherer state because they can't incorporate into the economy. They trade with the with Portuguese speakers. They've never learned any Portuguese, and they have no idea of equivalence of value. They have no concept when they trade, allegedly, of what would be roughly equivalent to what. And so there is that worry, but as I say, it's all we've got. And as I say, the only thing we have directly is this evidence on heights, going back to the hunter-gatherer era, right? The other thing I should say here is that one other sign, sorry, I have to go all the way back here. If you look at this diagram, what's going to produce high living standards, right? One thing would be reductions in birth rates. Early studies of pre-industrial Europe found that the Europeans, Northern Europeans, were limiting fertility by late marriage and by abstinence from marriage, and were only having about half of all potential births. So the average woman had only 5 births in this society. And that was thought initially to show that, you know, Europeans had made this important transition. They had individual rationality. It was a sign of things to come, and it was a sign that there was something different about Europe. Later studies, though, in Japan and in China have shown that in Japan and China, both of those societies, the average woman had 5 births. It's the same as in Europe. It's done by a completely different mechanism. Women marry early and universally, but there's much greater spacing between births. And we don't know exactly why that was happening. There's also female infanticide, which is very conscious individual rationality, which has very profound effects because it reduces the number of women in the next generation. And so it turns out that the Europeans are not distinct, right? It turns out now these studies of forager societies show that the average woman had about 5 children. They marry early, but again, they have this much longer spacing, and part of that is just because you cannot afford to have 2 kids at once because you have to move every day in a lot of these societies, and there's no one to carry the children. And so they have mechanisms to ensure that there's the appropriate spacing. And so the interesting thing is, one of the reasons is we can't expect that living standards would rather increase that much because there's no sign that birth rates have actually increased, have actually decreased in this long pre-industrial interval. And then the second thing is, well, what about the death rate? It turns out that, you know, if Europe and Japan, if England and Japan had the same birth rate, how come living standards were so much higher in England? The answer would have to be death rates. That somehow death rates were much greater in England than they were in Japan at the same living standard, right? And it turns out that the English had the advantage that they were, it was a filthy society. They lived in filth. They wallowed in filth. And in the book I described, for example, Samuel Pepys is a great source about the lifestyle of the upper classes in London in the 1660s. They're still running his diary, like one day on a website. There's a page of the diary every day that you can just look up. And you could follow through, right? And so Pepys in his diary, in 10 years, records his wife as having taken 1 bath in those entire 10 years. And it's a noteworthy episode. He actually records she pretends to this resolution to being clean, and she heads off with the maid to the baths because they don't have one in the house. And then she won't let him sleep with her, she won't let him sleep in the bed that night because he's still filthy. But there's no further reference to him being exiled from the bed or to the baths continuing after that one episode. There's another thing in Pepys where he goes down into his basement one time and is treading in the turds that have spilled over from his neighbor's basement because they kept the human waste in the basements of the houses, the upper classes in London. They're living above these piles of filth, and then they're emptied periodically by the cesspool men. In contrast, the Japanese bathed every day. They didn't have domestic animals. They swept the streets. There was a great culture of cleanliness. And also in Japan, human waste was very valuable for agricultural purposes. There was the British did not like to do that. It was a kind of social impediment. But in Japan, you paid your rent in part through your urine and feces, right? It was actually part of the rental contract was that the landlord got that. It was collected immediately, and they knew how to treat it so that it would not be dangerous before applying it in agriculture. And so you actually see this contrast that, you know, the English are wealthy in this period, but the wealth doesn't necessarily actually have much to do with their technology. It could have a lot to do with the appalling standards of hygiene. It's very hard, for example, for my price series, I wanted to get soap data. It's very hard to actually find data on soap expenditures in Britain in this period, and that may just be for accidental reasons. But it is this kind of contrast that you get. And so that's the picture we have of the world, and it seems to, at the mechanism, looking at hundreds of years, thousands of years, it seems to pretty accurately describe the world we were trapped in up until the Industrial Revolution. But one immediate implication of this Malthusian model is that I describe that in terms of the income per person in the society as a whole. But within all of these societies, there's tremendous inequality. And in fact, inequality is much greater in these pre-industrial agrarian societies than it is in the modern world. One of the great joys of the Industrial Revolution has actually been that it led to a decline, at least up until very recently, in inequality. And so you've got this variation across people, and the logic of this Malthusian model would seem to imply that the rich should be producing more than 2 surviving children, and the poor should be disappearing in these societies. Just the very simple logic of this Malthusian picture, it actually falls out right away that this should be the case. And when I started looking at this, I was actually motivated by 2 things. One is there's some theoretical work done by Oded Galor and Omer Moav, which has this idea that trying to explain the fertility transition as a particular type of evolution of preferences in the pre-industrial period. I don't think that model actually works in terms of the data. But one thing was, could we test that? And then the second thing was that Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, in the introduction says, look, why are people in New Guinea poor? He said, it can't be anything to do with any kind of genetic superiority of Europeans, or because people in New Guinea live by their wits, right? You achieve position in the society as a male by forming alliances, by fighting other people, by forming coalitions. In these settled agrarian societies, China or India or Europe, survival is all about what gut bacteria you have. Once you get these large concentrations of people together, you get epidemic diseases and endemic complaints, and you're going to select people for just their ability to have the right kind of biology in terms of their basic physiological processes. And I knew also by then that places like London, where a lot of the educated people in Britain were, about 1/3 of the population of London was disappearing in each generation. Hygiene conditions are so poor in the cities that they're constantly having to be replenished by a flow of people in from the countryside. And it tends to be, of course, that it's the most energetic, the most imaginative people you would think who would be doing this moving. And so it seemed like I was going to find that in England, what the surviving English were was the survival of rural idiocy. That it was the remnant population who last decided to leave the farm and who were the least. And so I actually thought that this would be a kind of an interesting kind of, one other possible talk about this is, well, why did this change? That you would actually find that this couldn't be the process that would bring about the modern world, because instead you would find this reverse, where we had devolved in terms of various characteristics since the time of hunter-gatherers because of the nature of these pre-industrial societies. And so the only thing I could add to this was that how to figure out a way of figuring out people's fertility as a function of their economic status. And what I use for this is the wills of male testators, right? Because I figured out that you can get tons of transcripts of these wills. And the existing wills in England for the pre-industrial period, there must be 5 or 6 million wills that exist for pre-industrial England, right? So
digitized?
there's 1.5 million that are available on the web at the Public Record Office, but that's from the higher class court, the Canterbury Court. The local ones are not available mostly on digital form, but there's a whole bunch of these local wills. And so that's why I was, it's hard to estimate exactly how many there are, but there's this huge collection. But the handwriting is so difficult that you want it turns out demographers are very interested. There's a huge interest in the history that's maintained by demographers and people studying their own family history. And so a lot of these have been transcribed by people in these demographic research. And so I'm just piggybacking on this incredible, gigantic demographic exercise. And so, for example, the Mormon Church has formed these gigantic databases of demographic information. And I'm eternally grateful to them because it turns out it's part of this investigation is that incredible exercise. But since the book came out and there were a number of criticisms, I found another source, because the wills only look at the top half of the population. And the other source I have, which I'm just working on now, is the surnames survival for the rich and the criminal in England, where I can actually identify surnames that are characteristic of rich people in 1600 and that are characteristic of criminals, and then ask what happens to the frequency of those surnames over time. And what we'll see is that these names, I'll show you the names, they don't look any different, but the names of criminals disappear, and the names of the rich maintain in the society. I still have to see if there could be some other explanation. It works surprisingly well. But that's additional information, and it gets to this question about whether this could be a long-run process, because here we're looking at 250 years of this process operating, as opposed to the wills where you're just looking at parents and their children. And there's some issue about, well, maybe these people just regressed immediately to the mean, and so that you have very little impact in terms of the long-run characteristics of the population. So for the wills, what I can then get is the wills tell you the occupation and something about the social rank of the person. So some were laborers leaving wills and gentry. For the source I have, it's not the wills of the richest. So it's the wills of the kind of upper middle classes and the upper working classes, right? It's that middle range. It correlates very well with the literacy of the will writer, their social status. And then the average value of the bequest, this is for this earlier period here, actually correlates very nicely. And so you get this kind of quite strong differentiation. And 42 pounds, to give a measure of that, a cow was worth 4 pounds at this time. So this is people on average, laborers were leaving the equivalent of 10 cows, right? And it would be maybe 2 years' wages for a carpenter, right? On average, these people were leaving. But there's a lot who are leaving a lot less than this, right? So you're getting the whole range essentially from 0 up until about 11,000 pounds, right? But these are not the very richest people in this society. There are people who would be leaving 100,000, even 1 million. Not, well, that might be too high, but certainly 100,000 in this society. And then what's the evidence from this data? So the wills specify, as far as we can tell, and there's various tests we can do, pretty much all the surviving children. For this poorest group here, who are leaving the equivalent of 2 cows or less, you can see that they actually are not replacing themselves, that they have fewer surviving children. So their share of the stock of the population, their genes are actually disappearing in the society. For the richest testators here, they're abundantly replacing themselves. In fact, they're doubling their share in the population, roughly, in each generation. And it's just this very, very powerful effect. And this exists even when you take into account the existence of the cities. It's just that the advantage of the rich occurs both in the countryside and in the cities, and so it outweighs this other effect. London is only 10% of the population. And so even though it has this terrible mortality effect, there's a lot of rich people outside London. And it's actually just, that particular intuition just doesn't carry through. It's just the tyranny of numbers. The share of the population in London is not big enough. And the second thing is that the rich within the cities continue to have this very great reproductive advantage. And so that consequently, you get this overall effect in the society. Now, one question is, do the rich only have a transient reproductive advantage? And this issue could be, well, suppose that the rich in England took over the society in the Middle Ages, but it was a bunch of thugs arriving from Normandy who grabbed the wealth of the society, and that then the group of people who had access to that wealth perpetuated themselves and formed this upper class, but they're essentially the same as everyone else. And so this is the famous quote from Ernest Hemingway, the rich are different from you and me, and then Scott Fitzgerald says, yes, they've got more money. And so one issue here is, do the rich have just a transient reproductive advantage, or are they any different? The second question is, are they really any different from the rest of the population? So in terms of whether they pass on characteristics, what I can do is that there's a bunch of wills of sons versus fathers, and it's quite hard to link these two groups, but gradually linking more and more of these, and we can just regress the log of the will of the son on essentially the log of the bequest of the father, and ask what this coefficient is, what this B coefficient is. And, and then the first thing we can do is also we can look at how many grandchildren there are per child as a function of the wealth of the testator that are mentioned in these wills. And you'll see that there is this continuation that rich parents leave more grandchildren that are mentioned in the will per child than poor parents. But that might just be because if you've got more to give, then you start mentioning more grandchildren. So more important then is what's the father-son transmission of wealth. And so here's just an estimate of the log, essentially, of the wealth of the son as a function of whether the father's alive, because they won't have had transmission of anything yet, if the father's still alive, or not limited transmission, and then the wealth of the father, the log of the wealth of the father. And you'll see that it's quite significantly connected, right? The sons of the rich are also rich in this society, but they're regressing towards the mean, okay? But if you look at the pattern here, this is the wealth of the fathers and the wealth of the sons, what you'll see is about half of the people in the sample who have wills are actually above the log of 4 here, okay? And so there's a huge mass of missing wills down here because your chance of making a will is greater the wealthier you are. And so the chance of finding 2 people is much greater if they're both wealthy, so you have to worry a lot about selection here. But the way I can just very crudely deal with this is to say, well, why don't we just omit everyone? Let's select on the x's. Let's just omit everyone in the bottom half here, and then just re-estimate the slope of this line. What that omission is going to do is it's going to actually bias the line upwards. The missing mass is actually going to be down here, we think. And so the bias, if anything, is actually, it's going to make it flatter. It's going to flatten out that connection between the wealth of fathers and the wealth of sons. And one simple way to try and correct partially for that is just to omit these people here where there's a lot of omitted information. And when we do that, if we drop these fathers' wills with less than 50 pounds left, then what we actually find is that that relationship does get stronger. And there's actually quite a tight connection between the wealth of fathers and the wealth of sons. And so the first thing we can say is something is being passed on here, right? There's a connection between the fathers and the sons. There's a strong selection in favor of more children for the rich. The children of the rich, when they die, also tend to be richer, though they are regressing towards the mean, okay? And then the next thing we can ask is this just the bequest versus genetics, socialization, or education, right? Is it just that the wealthy sons get wealth, they save some of that, and that's why they're wealthier also? And it turns out here that we have a nice feature is that, let's suppose our model is that the wealth of the son depends on the bequest of the father and the talent of the son with unknown weights, theta and 1 minus theta here, right? And the trouble is that we can observe this, but we don't observe the talent of the son, and we don't know how it's correlated with the bequest that the son receives. Question?
How do I think about the idea, okay, I'm a wealthy landowner,
right.
I'm going to die, I got 3 or 4 sons, I give everything to one, the other guys go off, immigrate, do other
right.
stuff. How do I think about that?
Well, I didn't mention this, but one characteristic of these people, because they're not the super wealthy, is that they tend to distribute their assets relatively equally amongst sons and daughters, right? And there is a bias in favor of sons compared to daughters, but it's not overwhelming. It's more like 60-40 in terms of sons versus daughters. And then sometimes one son gets significantly more than others, but it's often hard to tell because there are some inter-vivos transfers. And so sometimes it's the youngest son who's getting more, or it's a son for some unknown reason who's getting more money. There's also some disinheriting that goes on, but it's very limited in this period. And you can tell when someone's being disinherited when they get left 1 shilling. And the reason that's in there is so the kid can't argue that they got omitted by mistake from the will, right? And so you see it as a very deliberate device to actually make sure your name's in there and there's 1 shilling attached to it. And so it seems that on average, a son will get 1/n of the assets of the father, depending on how many siblings they have. And that's what we're going to try and use here to figure out, is it the wealth transfer that matters, or do the children actually inherit some kind of propensity to do well economically? Well, there's a question.
So when you make
yeah.
this is the very next slide,
Right.
answer both these questions, a flip way, a different way of spinning that result
Right.
of this transmission of wealth is to say this society was heavily stratified and there wasn't much social mobility. And so I always tend to think of societies that are
Right.
growing and
Right.
have a lot of social mobility,
Right.
And this is the polar opposite of that. There's not much social mobility.
No.
Kind of your argument for growth at some level.
Right. No, it has to be the case in this society that there's a lot of downward social mobility, right? Because there's only a certain amount of land, right? So a bunch of these guys own land. If the rich landowners are on average having 2 sons, then their sons have to be...
You have progression towards me, but the
Right.
tighter that relationship
Right.
is between wealth of
Right.
father and wealth of sons, I mean,
Right.
the flip side of the coin is lack of social mobility.
Right.
Right?
And this is something also, it's hard to convey without knowing a lot about the history of the society, but these social titles that people have, even though they're correlated with their economic status, they're very loosely correlated, right? It's actually a very mobile society in the sense that you can be a laborer, described as a laborer in this society, but some of these laborers actually have quite significant assets by the time they die. And so things like carpenters could become, what would happen is they would build houses and then start renting them out. And so you see actually in association, carpenters tend to own houses because they're in the building business and they become contractors essentially. And if you get enough of that stuff, you become a wealthy person, and then eventually you'll become a gentleman. It may not happen in this generation, but it actually is a surprisingly fluid...
I say you can have both.
Right.
If my father's wealthy and I'm wealthy,
Right.
then how can we also say that it's easy to rise from the bottom to the top? Because that would suggest a lack of correlation between parental wealth and personal success.
No, because 0.7 or 0.67 as a correlation still leaves a lot of room for movement. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
hard to have
yeah.
benchmarks on
Right,
this,
right.
And one
And
thing that
what-
maybe is the very next
right,
slide
right.
is you're going to say, oh, this is unique to English society and the kinds of...
Right. What I would say is, it's hard to estimate this number. I'm collecting more data, right, to try and pin down this number. It's an interesting number. The evidence is that actually it's less mobile than modern society, right? In the sense that that's a higher correlation between wealth, between fathers and sons than you would actually get in modern estimates of wealth, right? But it's not immobile. And actually, I'm going to show you some evidence with names here to illustrate just how there is upward movement as well in this society. Initially, I was thinking it's all downward movement, right? That there's a ruling class in England. They keep throwing off these extra children. They take over the whole of the society, and the poor actually just disappear completely, right? And that we would all be descended, those of us who are from England or the British Isles, essentially from an economic upper class of the Middle Ages, right? And that picture's not right, and I'll show you with the names evidence why that intuition is not correct.
That partly comes from illegitimate children. So in these wills, do you
Right.
know whether they are legitimate or illegitimate?
Yes.
Your genes would
Right.
be enhanced by
Right. The men are careful to specify this. In the period I'm looking at, there's very little illegitimacy. This is the period of kind of the Puritan revival. There are very strong social sanctions against illegitimacy in this period, and it's very limited in the data. I've now collected a much bigger sample of wills going all the way up till 1900. And we've got hundreds of them now for the Industrial Revolution period. And what you see is a flowering of illegitimacy in this period. But fathers also leaving money to their illegitimate children, right? But also things like where I'm living with this woman and I married her after, we gave birth to 3 children. So now I also have to specify in the will that I'm leaving money to them, even though, and the question was, well, why didn't you marry them before? It really becomes much more modern, the kind of, that pattern. I mean, not still the norm is a man will only have legitimate children, but you see one man who had 3 families with 3 different women, none of whom to which he was married, and another woman who he specifies as not getting anything in the will, even though she's his wife. Right, and so it's well known in the data that there is greater illegitimacy rates, but still in this early period, it's 1.5% of all births are estimated to be illegitimate. Amongst the upper classes, it would be even smaller. In the later period, it's up to something like 6% of all births. Yeah.
In the continent, perhaps the operational definition of illegitimacy is if you're legitimate, I can't mention you in my will.
If you're illegitimate. Yeah.
Only legitimate children inherit. That's why I'm very puzzled
right.
to hear.
Oh, no.
Illegitimate children are mentioned in the...
Oh, no, and no, there's no legal barrier to illegitimate children inheriting, right, in England. And the laws of English inheritance are such that the wife is supposed to get 1/3 of the assets of the husband, and then the rest can be dispersed in any way you want. It's not. I come from Scotland. Scottish law does not allow that. There's a minimum distribution to children that has to be met. And legitimate children, right? But English law, actually, that was the only stipulation. And it turns out typically the wives did not get that 1/3. Did not get that 1/3 that they were legally entitled to. Typically the men would leave all of the stuff to children with a little bit to the wife. And they don't seem to have been contested, these wills. And it's interesting, men behave as though they're trying to maximize their survival of their genes. They leave money to those who are blood relatives. If they don't have children, they leave them to their closest blood relatives, brothers, children. Wives often come to the marriage with earlier children because of higher mortality rates. They tend to get almost nothing.
That's a good way to make sure that the wife invests effort in your kids.
Right. We're giving them the money.
Yeah,
right.
give them the money, and then if
right.
they like the mom, they
right.
take care of
right.
it.
Right.
It's a strong social
right.
norm.
Well, and the big fear of men, this would take us again too far afield. I mean, these wills are fascinating. The big fear of men, if the wife is young, is that she will marry, shack up with some other guy, and then use your assets to raise another brood of children. And so often the will actually will contain a stipulation. The wife gets this amount unless she remarries, in which case it all goes to the children. Because I mean, there really is this. If you like sociobiology, the English of this period really kind of conform to that norm. I'm going to have to move on a little fast though here, because there's some interesting stuff to come. I hope it's interesting. So anyway, so this is the problem we face, is how to unbundle these effects. But one thing we can think of here is that the bequest to the son will actually be a function of the wealth of the father and the number of children. And that's essentially a huge random variable. You can be the only son, or there are some families here where there's 11 or 13 children that are left. And so there's this huge random shock. And so then we can estimate what's the wealth of the son as a function of the wealth of the father, but we would have minus this component here, right? If we think that the amount that's coming from the bequest is indexed by theta, there's going to be minus theta times n, where log of n, where n is the number of children, big N is the number of children, right? And so if we estimate this, what we should find, if it's all coming through wealth transmission, and theta here is 1, right? That's the only thing that matters, is that the coefficient on the log of the number of children should actually come out to be 1. And
T?
pardon?
Sorry, what's T?
And T is talent. T is the log, sorry, of the talent of the kid, right? And that's the thing that we can't observe, right? And we were just worried that this thing is going to be correlated with this thing, and so we'll get biased estimates here. But the idea is, well, we have this other way of estimating theta, which we think is not going to be correlated with TS. And so it will be isolated in this way. We can actually estimate what's the direct effect of wealth on the wealth of the sons. And when we do that estimate, where we drop the wills of the bequest as less than £50. Now the trouble is I didn't have a lot of data. I now have a lot more data in which to do this. That coefficient comes out to minus 0.208, but with a standard error of 0.185. So it's too early to tell. You can reject the idea that it's 1 though, right? And in fact, it looks like it's going to turn out to be relatively close to 0. So that the direct effect of wealth will be there, you know, in this estimate, but will actually be relatively modest. And that the sons are also succeeding economically because they share either some abilities or some training or something else with the fathers.
Is it really
Question?
that clean that if talent is heritable and talent is associated with how many kids you have, and it'll be correlated among siblings?
no, you're absolutely right that there's going to be a correlation between this and this, right? But even though there's that overall correlation, the R squared of that relationship is actually extremely low, right? I mean, you need a lot of data to tell that the wealthy have many more kids than the poor, so that there's a huge random element as well in determining n, right? There's a systematic element, right? And anyway, I think the bias there would tend to be in favor of finding that coefficient bigger. I think the bias would actually run in the other direction. But let me press on because we'll run out of time. So anyway, so that's something we can explore. There's some other data here which I won't even go over in detail, which tries to establish that this pattern actually existed for the rich all the way back till 1250 when we first get data. We can also look at the reproductive success of other groups in England. And the interesting thing here, again, going into this, I didn't expect to find this pattern because I knew about this famous study of the demography of English aristocrats. And this is really just ducal families. So it's the top families in England. And using their genealogies going all the way back 1330 to 1829. And what you find with these guys is this is the number of sons on average that they were having. Remember, for these rich people in my period, it's 2. These people have actually less reproductive success than the general population. And it's only later in the Industrial Revolution period that they actually begin to do quite well. But still not that much above the general population. Their life expectancy at birth is lower than the average population for the late Middle Ages. And life expectancy at 20 is also, the further years of expectancy is pretty low. What happens though with this group though is they engage in violence. There's internal assassinations, there's foreign wars. What's happening with the aristocracy is a lot of them don't survive to actually produce families. And so what's interesting here about English society, we'll come and look at this, is you've evolved a social structure where violence is not a successful strategy. Commerce is a successful strategy in terms of which group is taking over the population. Yeah.
Why is male life expectancy at birth higher than...
Oh, sorry, I should label this clearly. It's further years of life expectancy at age 20, right? Right. And so you've got 22 further years, right? Yeah, right. And so, and the interesting feature in this society is that life expectancy obviously only maximizes future life expectancy at 12. And so you get free the first 12 years. So now it was disappointing when I was doing the book that the only study I could find of reproductive success and people's characteristics was amongst the male Yanomamo in 1987. And this is this famous study by Napoleon Chagnon, who is this very pugilistic anthropologist, short guy. And he has actually been accused of fomenting most of these killings that he studied. And there's a famous expose that was actually, the American Anthropological Association had to have a formal kind of court of inquiry into whether he had committed genocide. Because the claim of this later book was that he was the one who started all these wars that he was writing about by supplying the different sides with weapons. And it really was like Kurtz or whatever it is, upriver in the heart of darkness. And so in Yanomamo society, it turns out that people distinguish amongst males between those who are killers and those who are not, because if you kill, you have to go through a purification ceremony. So it's like we have PhDs. In Yanomamo society, it's well known who's a killer and who's not. And over the life course, what you see is the number of killers increases. And all of this killing tends to be done in these informal raids. They're continually raiding each other's villages. And a bunch of men will set out on a raid. You can get your foot injured partway out of the raid, and about half the people typically will come back before the raid is actually launched because they're tired, they decide they want to do something else. And so it's really voluntary participation in violence, but it is dangerous once you attack this other group. And so, so you get this pattern then that over the life course, more and more men actually kill someone else. And then you've got these non-killers, and they're declining in frequency, but by the time they're in their 40s, it's still the case that about maybe 40% of the men have never killed, and 60% have killed someone. And then Chagnon just calculated, well, how many offspring at each age interval did killers and non-killers have? And it turns out that at all age levels, killers produce more offspring, and the reason is that women are attracted in Yanomamo society to killers. And it's not a bad mate choice in this society because they have more command of resources, they have more power within the group. And so that Shangyong's argument is that essentially violence perpetuates in this society because violence is not an unsuccessful strategy. Now, this is actually not good data because it looks at successful killers versus successful non-killers in the sense of still surviving, right? If I told you, you know, Bob, we're sending you to Yamamamo society, if you want to prosper here, you better go and kill someone, right? Likely you or I would end up dead because we're not experienced in violence. And so it's consistent with the possibilities that the social structure here is rewarding violence. It's not proving that there's an inherent tendency.
Presumably the people who, you know, the reason they're,
Right.
partly the reason they're attractive is because they can protect women too, I would think. Killers also probably good protectors.
Potentially, yes. I mean, I don't know exactly what it is that they contribute. Right, right. So in a kind of follow-up to this study, you know, so what I could show so far with these wills is wealthy have more children. They pass on these characteristics to their children. The way that passes on is actually through probably genetics or socialization, mainly. The question that came up, though, is Sam Bowles, in his review of the book in Science, said regression towards the mean would destroy this effect within 1 or 2 generations, right? Even with these levels of correlation, within a few generations, the children of the rich will look like anyone else in the society. And you will actually not get much long-run effect in this. And I think that that's mistaken because the point is there's a new class of rich in each period, right? I mean, the point is this is a society which is always throwing up a new group of successful people, and the selection is made in each generation with this new group. If it was just one group and there was one, you know, selection and we just looked at them and their children, we will find that they regress towards the mean. We will find exactly the phenomena they're talking about. But the point is that there's randomization around in each round, and then there's a new group of successful people. But what I could actually do here with the rich is 2 things. One is to look at the very poor, and the indicted in this period tended to be overwhelmingly be laborers who are really, you know, not represented amongst the rich group who are leaving wills. And the question was, well, how can we use names to actually follow their reproductive success over 250 years? And the way I did it was this. It turns out that someone has actually collected, in 1910, 1911, someone published 2 books. And these books consist simply of a list of all the names found in parish registers in England in the years 1601 and 1602. I think they were planning to do the entire 17th century, but the publisher pulled the plug on the enterprise. And I don't know how many copies survived, right? But they're just a list. They're just a list of all of the names that were found in parish registers. And it turns out they had about 10% of all parish registers in England in that period. And you can calculate that it's about a 1.8% sample of all names in England in this period. And it turns out that English surnames are highly varied because in the pre-industrial world, 4 first names describe more than half of all men and more than half of all women. There's no imagination with first names because there's rules that you tend to give the child the name of your father, your mother, you know, and so they follow within these families then in unending repetition. And so John Smith is followed by John Smith, right? And so, but while there are some very common English names like Smith, I think the top 14 names in England describe only 13% of the population. Now and also back then, there's a huge number of names in England that are held by handfuls of people. And so what I do is I take the criminal records from Essex around about 1600, which is full of people indicted for various offenses, and I take the people who commit things like robbery, burglary, assault. I don't include, there are a few people included for economic crimes like violating someone's monopoly. I actually excluded them. And what I do is I run them through this sieve of, say, are they on this list from 1601 or 1602? Is that name on the list? And a name, for example, like Spill Timber, which I had hopes for, it turns out that that's on the list. There were 2 criminal spill timbers, and there's a spill timber on these parish registers. So that name is thrown out then. And so we only leave names that occur amongst criminals but that don't occur in the parish register. And for the rich testators, I do the same process, and as the final filter, I say you can't, if you're on this name here, you can't be on the names of the rich as well. There are some, you know, and this filter is imperfect. If there was actual randomization of names, it would be actually very, very good. And you would be very unlikely to get a name held by more than something like 40 people. But there's clumping of names in particular parishes, and so it's not so good. So you're going to find some relatively common names will actually slip through. And so when I do that, here's just every 1 in 10 of the names of the indicted that survive, and you can see they just don't look that different from the names of the rich, right? Elvis is actually here. Drink halls suggest that, you know, may be a reason for his thing, and then fatter is one of the rich here. But also base, suggesting, you know, that he's a bastard. And cobbled actually turns out, when I showed this, I did an earlier seminar, someone said, oh, Suffolk, that's a very, cobbled, there's a beer family now. There's Old Peculiar or something. There's these, not Old Peculiar, but there's some famous beers that were made by the cobbled family, right? And so you get these two groups. And as I say, when you look at these lists, the names don't look that different. Then what I do is go to the 1841 and 1851 census in England and calculate the average occurrence, the median occurrence of these names. I don't do the average because, as I say, some quite common names slip through. I mean, not that common, but names held by, you know, 2,000 or 3,000 people. And when you do that, what you find is that for the indicted, the median occurrence of the name by then is 27%, and then 21% of those names have disappeared. And I'm looking at all obvious spelling variants, right? These are spelled phonetically earlier, these names. 27 occurrences, there's 4 times the population by 1841 to 51. And so that meant that unless the median indicted person had a name that was held by only something like 6 people back in 1600, their frequency, name frequency, is actually declining in the population, right, as a proportion. And then you've got the poorest testators, middling, and then the richest testators, and you can see that there are about 4 times as many of these names surviving for the rich testators. And so you actually do get this kind of interesting evidence that over 250 years, if I just know that a name was rare and held by a criminal, I can predict something about its frequency by 1851, right? And
you expect criminals to change names, right?
Well, except...
AKA?
I do look at, some of these guys are listed with aliases, and aliases are not any more common amongst the rich than amongst the criminals. And also, I mean, the kind of things they're committing here, I mean, if they're living in a village, no one, how can I put it, I don't think there's that much incentive for them to change their names, right? And some of them, by the way, are executed, right, which might account for their dropping out of the population, right? But what is interesting here, though, is that you can see that the bottom end of the society is really not showing up. Now, but I didn't put this in here. It turns out, though, I can look at the occupations of these guys in 1851 compared to their occupations in this earlier period. And what happens, very interestingly, is, so far, I haven't got enough data yet to be sure of this, there seems to be complete regression to the mean. That is, fewer of the criminal class survive, but by the time you reach 1851, by 8 generations later, they don't look any different. And also, if you look at the rich, and these names that were held by the rich, they have regressed to the average of the population as well. And so that and it made me realize that this process is one of selective survival here, but there is also upward mobility going on in the society, as well as downward mobility. And it's just because there's going to be this kind of selection in each generation in pre-industrial England that you're going to have this constant pressure on the population in terms of the characteristics of individuals. And so, as I say, this is just early work here. But in the last time, what I wanted to show you then is we've got this process going on. It's having effects over 250 years at least. In fact, over 600 years in England, we can see sign of this process. Did anything interesting happen at the same time in England? And I'll just talk about 2 things here since we're running out of time. I'll talk about interest rates and violence. And so this chart shows the 2 measures of real rates of return in England in this period. The first is the return on holding farmland, just the rent divided by the purchase price. And you can see that in contemporary England it's about 2%. In the Middle Ages it's between 10 and 12% at its peak in the Middle Ages here. And there's another asset which is a loan secured by land that doesn't come under the usury provisions at any stage. And you'll see that follows pretty well, though there are some deviations in some periods. And this should be a real return, and this should be a nominal return, but the average rate of inflation in England over these years typically is from 1270 till 1530, the rate of inflation was 0. Inflation rates are very, very low, and it's very stable price level in the long term in the society. And what's interesting about this change is, what I'm trying to convince you is that has to reflect a fundamental change in people's psychology in these economies, right? Now, looking at this as economists, what you're absolutely going to be thinking is, this must reflect something about institutions, something about security of property holding, something else that would actually explain this differential. Because the first thing we can think of is, this is the period up to 1850 of no or very little economic growth. Then we have a period of economic growth. All kind of models of growth would suggest that the underlying interest rate in the society should increase once you have economic growth. Because then you need to pay people more. If I know my income's higher in future, I want to defer consumption to the future, and to equilibrate the capital market, you're going to have to pay people more. And so, who do you call them? There's a paper, Malthus to Solo, that Prescott has in the AER, which looks at this transition and which has exactly that effect, where they predict that interest rates actually will go up by 1 or 2% as a result of the onset of modern growth. But as I say, the stylized fact is that actually interest rates went down. And so one thing we would expect is an increase. Now, this is England. We can actually go back to earlier societies. The earliest one is Sumer, a precursor to Babylonia. Silver loans there are in the range of 20 to 25%. If you look at these earlier societies, if you look at mortgages in Neo-Babylonia, it's 16 to 20%. And again, these are societies with relatively stable price levels. We do know the movement of prices in Babylonia. And it's just a very important kind of stylized fact about the history of the world up till 1800, is that there has been this unexplained but very long-run decline in the underlying interest rate in societies, which reached modern levels only in something like the 17th or 18th century. Okay?
And that's true for all, not just English society.
Yes. So what I'm saying is, what I'm saying is, it's true for all earlier societies that they have these very high rates of return. It's also true of societies like Japan and China as late as the 17th or 18th century, that they have much higher rates of return than something like England in that period, right? But it's also true that where we can observe it, we tend to observe a decline in these rates of return. All medieval Europe has rates of return of about 10%, right? It declines in all societies. It declines more rapidly in some of them than in others, okay? But it's just a general characteristic, kind of interesting characteristic. And as I say, economists would tend to think, well, this is just some kind of default risk. Note that it can't just be the risk of death, because that's really not changing before 1800, right? The risk of death is actually, the life expectancy is actually 1 over the birth rate in the Malthusian equilibrium. And since I said, you know, early societies all tend to have these similar birth rates, you can see that it's not life expectancy that's changing in any significant way when this change is occurring. And so all of it has got to come down to the risk of expropriation or destruction of capital, right? What we know about medieval England, though, is that it's actually a very stable society, at least the southern part of the society where this data comes from. In the north, you had the problem of the Scots. But in the southern part, all the way through from 1200 till 1350, where I get a lot of this data, it really is pretty stable. There are some internal revolts and warfare, but most of the villages in England would see nothing, no fighting, nothing throughout this entire period. And what I can do in England is actually measure real land prices all the way by decade from the 1200s up to 1340s, and often with a relatively small number of observations. It's hard to get observations where you have both the rent and the price. And what you see is that agricultural land is an incredibly stable asset in this society. It holds its value. It can be bought in units as small as 1/4 of an acre. It's traded in very small units in all of these manorial courts. It's turned over apparently by legal processes for many, many generations within these courts. And it offers people in all of these little village communities, had investments available, land and housing, that paid a real return guaranteed of 10%. Now, if you could get that on the stock markets in the modern world with all of the fluctuations involved in those, you'd be very happy, right? But here was a society with these. This is like investing in like a Reserve Bank of New Zealand bonds, essentially, in this society. It really is a very, very stable asset, but offering these phenomenally high rates of return. Also in this diagram, I show land prices in Zela in northern Belgium. Well, there's a lot of fighting between the Dutch and the Spanish, and then between the French and the Dutch, and the French and the English. And you can see there that there are significant fluctuations in land prices over this period. But as I say, England, it's not like that. It's actually a very, very stable society. And all I can say is that when you observe this, the only thing that's considered is this is a society of extraordinary impatience. It looks like modern society in terms of markets and other features, but it's a society which is governed by an extraordinary degree of impatience. And it shows up also in terms of, we can look at grain prices. We have dated grain prices, dated by day in England, right? Those grain prices show a rise between harvests for wheat in this period of something like 16%, right? By the 18th century in England, that rise is more in the order of 5 or 6%. And so you can see in all of the features of the society that people storing grain, they're aware of, that you should hold it. If you hold it later, the price will be higher, but they're not willing to hold it till just before the next harvest unless they get this very substantial reward. And so it really just seems to be a society dominated by impatience. And it turns out that if you go to descriptions of hunter-gatherer society, it's very strongly emphasized in most of those descriptions, high degrees of impatience, right? That modern kind of time preference rates really seem to have occurred sometime between the hunter-gatherer era and the modern world. And what's interesting in England is that change is actually occurring at the same time as people who would be accumulating or have that instinct for accumulation would be doing better economically and would consequently produce more offspring, right? And that potentially there could be a gene for impatience, which is actually disappearing in this English society, and that you would eventually find, some location for this. The other thing I'll just talk about very briefly is violence. And it turns out that in hunter-gatherer society, the stylized fact again is that these tend to be highly violent societies. And so this is the homicide rate per 1,000 for some, again, just societies where I could get this evidence. So now New Guinea is not really hunter-gatherer, but it's still very violent. And then the Ache, this group in Paraguay, it's 15 males per 1,000 per year, with a life expectancy of something like 35 years at birth, and exposed to that risk in each year, it's saying that half of all the people there die violently in this society. Okay? And as I say, it's not a bad thing in the hunter-gatherer world because that improves living standards, right? The existence of this violence pushes up the death rate, and you're going to die of something. And if the birth rate is at a given level, then it's better to die by, living well economically and then getting clubbed at the end of it than living in miserable circumstances but never having to face the fear of violence. Okay? And so that these societies are violent. What's interesting is that even the United States, where I now live, its violence pales in comparison with just the ordinary levels of violence in hunter-gatherer society. And what you actually see is we can actually trace homicide rates in England, again, per 1,000, all the way back to about 1200. And this was because the king in England had a financial investment in murder, which was that all the assets of a murderer defaulted to the king. And so right. And so what actually happened then is that the king had inquiries in each county in England periodically to look into all suspicious deaths and discover which were murderers and who had committed these murders. And juries were impaneled, and so we get this pretty good evidence. For some reason, I'm relying on various secondary sources here. There's not much reported for this period of the Black Death, where population declines a lot, there's various other disruptions, and then the evidence picks up again in the Elizabethan period. But what you see is that in terms of just ordinary murder rates in the society, there is this significant and continuing decline as we move from the medieval to the modern period. Question?
lot of variance in that data. Is there
Right.
any way of correlating that with the financial exigencies of the Crown? So they might be looking harder to improve murders that weren't really murders.
Most murderers
If they
were
can't
poor.
extract supply from Parliament.
Right.
Most murderers were from the bottom of society.
Well, most murderers were, but it was the case though that the king still felt it worthwhile to actually have these inquiries, right? I mean, because it was motivated by the crown, these investigations.
But you might have enough data points so that you could say something about
Right.
the Crown needs more money from a war.
Right.
Can't get,
Just,
can't get
right.
supply from Parliament.
Right. I think it would be. It's not going to produce the kind of funding that the crown would really need in these terms because of this fact that a lot of these guys will actually be pretty poor. One of the things that's interesting is that there's no improvement in medical care over this period, right? So it's not that people are surviving better. If anything, with the introduction of handguns in this period, there's more lethal methods of violence, though they're used relatively rarely in crimes in England. And then if you look at the judicial system, it's actually quite easy to get away with murder in England in the 17th century because there was a rule that was introduced in the medieval period in the legal system that clerics could not be tried in ordinary courts, secular courts. And so what actually happens is that they have to have a test then of whether you're a cleric or not, and the test was whether you could read. Right? In the medieval period, only the clergy could read. And so there was a standard passage of the Bible that you would plead benefit of clergy, they would hand the Bible to you, you would read this passage, if you succeeded, then you got off, right? And theoretically, the ecclesiastical courts were then supposed to deal with you appropriately, but in actual practice, they never did. And so this provision, as I say, it's a very limited group who gets this in the Middle Ages. By this period in England, almost 40%, 50% of men are literate. It's still used widely in the criminal courts, and it's still an entitlement. And so in these records I see in Essex, people murder someone and then plead benefit of clergy and then are released. After the Reformation, yeah. And it's actually, and in some cases people plead benefit of clergy and then it just says, can't read, hung. And so it's actually a society where literally there is actually this incentive towards literacy, which is that it is your get out of jail free card in this period. Now, I believe that they actually limited the application there so that you only got one felony. And then they would brand you on the thumb after you pleaded the first time, and that's what they needed for identification purposes, right? Because identification is very poor, and so they brand you on the thumb, and then if you show up again, they check your thumb first, and if you've already had that benefit, then you're right. And so the interesting thing here, as I say, is that you really do, and it's not just in this respect that the society is getting more pacific. In terms of just the ordinary features of the society, you see this incredible delight in blood and mayhem in this early period. I mean, that in early medieval England, there were judicial duels that were fought. And there are only a few of these that were actually fought, but people would love a judicial duel where these people would literally fight to the death. And already, even in the 18th century, it was a treat to go to Bedlam in London to see the lunatics. And just, it was a regular tourist attraction. And you can actually see that in general, there is a kind of a middle class nature that creeps into the society over this long period. And as I say, the interesting thing is that process is occurring at exactly the same time as the people who are engaging in violence, who are failing economically, who are not doing well, who are also the ones who are going abroad to foreign wars, are also, I suspect, doing poorly in this survival lottery. And it does create this interesting possibility, at least, that capitalism created its own culture, right? And it's kind of Marxist view in the end that the forces of production in terms of having, once you set up these stable market economies, that it created its own dynamic in the pre-industrial world, which tended to move you in the direction of a certain type of person. And in the book argues that there was I'll take just 1 minute extra. The book argues that there was only one event that really mattered in history, the Industrial Revolution. And so there's actually a quote in one of the chapters from this German philosopher when I was writing the book at this institute in Berlin, who said, now I understand your theory. You have one event that occurs in the course of history and you don't understand it. What kind of theory is this? And Right? And so now I've actually come on reflection to realize there are actually two events in history, not one. And the other important one is the development of these stable market economies earlier. Because I was thinking of this as just a kind of an inevitable byproduct of the Neolithic Revolution, that once you had settled agriculture, then you developed this kind of system. But it turns out that if you go to places like New Guinea, you can find societies that have settled agriculture, but have not developed a social structure which has stable transmission of property values and it avoids a lot of conflict and a lot of competition through violence. And so that actually seems to be the crucial earlier step in history which occurred in a group of societies and which then sets in motion, as I say, a movement towards a culture which is much more like modern culture than in original hunter-gatherer societies. So that's the slice of the book from now. So there's more in the book if you want to have a look at it.
We're actually about out of time.
Sure.
I want to make a couple announcements. I think there's a group going to the staff club afterwards, so if you got questions and want to talk more about this, you can. If you like the talk today, I would strongly encourage you to purchase the book. Don't be a scrub and borrow it.